The Simpson case consequently raises an important question for Durkheimian social theory. Can there be a common conscience in a racially mixed, multi-ethnic, and multicultural society? And this is no simple question, and there is no simple answer. Mine goes something like this. I believe that across this racial divide we do share fundamental social bonds on issues of crime and collective sentiments. If asked, blacks and whites together will find criminality, murder, robbery, rape abhorrent. I expect that a survey would tell me that Americans across the racial board would agree that murderers should be severely punished, even though there might be different views expressed on capital punishment. I expect that blacks and whites would agree also on the relative seriousness of different crimes, although with respect to vice crimes such as gambling, prostitution, and drugs, there might be some disagreement. So I believe that Durkheim is essentially right in saying that criminal acts evoke deeply ingrained sentiments in most members of society. And he's also right in asserting that such acts provoke a sense of outrage, anger, indignation, even a passion for vengeance. So the difference between whites and blacks is not that they have different feelings about crime, that they have a different common conscience, but that they have very different feelings and experiences about the criminal justice system. This is something which Durkheim did not discuss and could not appreciate. He neglected entirely the difference between the substantive law of crime and the administration of criminal justice. As to the former, America is largely a nation unified. With respect to the criminal justice system, America is a nation divided. In this respect, the Simpson case is neither new nor surprising. When a jury in Simi Valley acquitted the officers who beat Rodney King, people everywhere were astonished, asking how could the King trial jurors have acquitted the police officers? The answer in part is that the jury is not a rational fact-finding institution and was never meant to be. Judges are perfectly capable of hearing evidence and deciding guilt or innocence. Historically, juries were conceived as a check on judges who were thought to be so close to the authorities that ordinary folks would be treated unfairly in the courtroom. The independence of juries in criminal cases is so valued that they are allowed to nullify the evidence and fail to convict when it is perfectly clear, as many believe in both the King and Simpson trials, that the defendants were guilty. The problem is that those who sit on juries are supposed to be representative of and conscious of the community. The ancient word is the vicinage, where the crime occurred, and that's why the Constitution requires not only an impartial jury, but also a jury, quote, of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. But tragically, when venue is shifted, that does not necessarily happen. In the King trial, the Simi Valley jurors were miles away from the deaths and fires and property damage that followed their verdict. In the Simpson trial, I believe that a jury of wealthy Brentwood residents like OJ Simpson himself would have convicted him. America is, experientially speaking, two countries. One is multicultural and predominantly non-white. It suffers disproportionately from crime, gang violence, poverty, homelessness, police brutality, and corruption. The other is suburban, relatively safe, relatively prosperous, and predominantly white. Like the Simi Valley jury that acquitted the cops who beat Rodney King, it is predominantly middle class. The cops charged with assaulting Rodney King committed their crimes in the first America, but they were tried in the second. OJ Simpson committed his crimes in the second America, but was tried in the first. That both cases were tried where they were was one among the many failures of the Los Angeles prosecutor's office, and for reasons that remain obscure. In the Rodney King case, the district attorney might have been overconfident or might have leaned over backwards to be, quote, fair to the cops. In the O.J. Simpson case, I have read that the prosecutors were concerned about the credibility of a conviction to the African-American community that had rioted after the Simi Valley verdict. I have earlier written that the videotape beating of Rodney King was so compelling, had the assaulting cops been tried anywhere in urban America, in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, they would have been convicted. In these places, in the first America, the brutality shown on the King videotape confirmed the worst nightmare of African Americans and all Americans about police violence against blacks. Police brutality, especially in the inner cities of the first America, shakes the confidence of the public in the police. In suburban America, residents and juries who are unfamiliar with such behavior are apt to reflexively support the police. And I have just a few minutes, so I will go on. Now, let me move to a conclusion. Juries in urban America, like predominantly black juries in Washington, D.C., have been reluctant to convict obviously guilty young African American men because they say they don't want to send more young black men to jail even if they are guilty. But these are mostly drug cases, and perhaps in these cases jury nullification is more understandable. Drug enforcement is seen to discriminate against black males, and certainly it certainly does. Jury nullification is rarely, if ever, a rejection of basic moral norms. Rather, it is a rejection of the administration of criminal justice. So it all seems so clear in retrospect. Without Mark Fuhrman, the defense never had a case against a mountain of evidence. But Fuhrman's virulent expressions of racism shocked the jurors and the rest of us. Police can make two kinds of mistakes. One might be called procedural, the kind we all make when we're under strain. The other is a violation of moral norms, such as lying, framing a suspect, brutality, or corruption. Cops like Mark Fuhrman make many citizens, and especially those of color, assume that ordinary police mistakes are normative ones. They won't believe police testimony, and justice will be frustrated. So the Simpson case teaches us three lessons. One, not only are racist and lying cops morally evil, they are dangerous to the justice system and must be aggressively rooted out of police departments. This is a message that Commissioner William Bratton of the NYPD gave yesterday at a Harvard conference that Alan Dershowitz had sponsored. Second, there is a much greater racial divide in this country than we had imagined. This is not, however, a divide of moral values, of common conscience, but of experience. African Americans deeply mistrust the administration of criminal justice, and especially its chief representatives, the police. The jurors thought about what Johnny Cochran had asked them to think about, sending a message to the LAPD and their life after jury service. Finally, many will ask whether our criminal justice system will survive when decisions are made not on the basis of evidence, but on long-held grievances, no matter how deeply felt and how historically justified. I believe that this case will have, as we say, legs. Questions will be raised about jury selection practices, jury size, and our assumptions about the role of lawyers in the adversary system as a way to produce truth. It won't matter that, as we all know, this case is scarcely typical. What will count is that it will not be ignored, and that's why we're all here today. Those who feel that an injustice has been committed will insist on some change in the way we do business in American criminal courtrooms. We did develop a remedy for racist jury nullification, namely civil rights laws penalizing those who harass or who intimidate or who brutalize under color of law. It will be harder to construct a remedy for nullification by urban non-white juries, but I think that perhaps the best remedy would be to reform urban police and criminal justice so that they will be fair and will be believed to be fair, and then we won't have to be concerned about such jury nullification. Thank you.
Next speaker is going to be Gilbert Geis.
I want to begin with the thought that perhaps someday an enterprising experimental social scientist, blessed with time, money, and above all ingenuity, will carry out a research program that will vary the major ingredients, especially those related to race, that characterize the case of the People versus Simpson. Then, and very likely only then, will we be able to more meaningfully come closer to answers to the questions that were posed during that particular case and pervaded media and citizen post-mortem dissertations on the elements that seem to play such a prominent part in the outcome of the trial. At the meeting, at the moment at least, reflexive judgments such as those that maintain that money trumps race in the marketplace of justice have to be hedged with so many ifs and buts and maybes that the conclusion, as well as virtually all the second guesses about the verdict, remain very far from scientifically sound positions. An N of 1 always leaves a great deal to be desired. A single case study can provide superb insight into matters that are buried alive or that are stillborn in aggregate research with compromised operational definitions. The case study can disprove a categoric hypothesis or a theory which claims universality, but it cannot satisfactorily support the kinds of global conclusions that so abundantly have followed in the wake of the Simpson trial. The research that I'm talking about in Utopia would vary only one element of the trial at a time, while somehow, if this is feasible, would truncate the time span of the events, hopefully without losing any significant components of what went on. The last, perhaps, is virtually impossible. If, in fact, the sequestration of the jury for such a prolonged period of time played into the result that we reached, then, of course, that component has to be included in any attempt to really find out what happened. I might add in this regard that a colleague of mine, a lawyer psychologist in my department, who played a very minor role on the defense team, told me very confidently a week before the verdict was due that he clearly expected it to be unanimous. He wasn't sure which way, but he was sure it would be unanimous. The reason he gave was that any jury sequestered for that length of time would not come in with an inconclusive outcome, that it simply psychologically defied human personality to waste that much time and not to make an impact of some significance in terms of the task which you'd been assigned. Anyway, if my colleague's interpretation of the verdict dynamics is accurate, then somehow or other that condition must be factored into an experimental design directed toward understanding what eventuated in that Los Angeles courtroom. Let me present to you some of the variables, and they're endless, but I'll select a few for starters. In each instance, the question to be addressed is whether the altered circumstance would have changed or in any way varied the jury outcome. First, let's look at the race of the victims. If Nicole Simpson had been black, would this have made a difference? If OJ Simpson was guilty of murder, in fact, though not by jury verdict, it may be, or it may not be, accurate that there would have been less likelihood of the killing because of the marital rejection, which would not have carried the historical emotional voltage that long has marked interracial relationships in the United States. Would the jury have been more sympathetic to a black victim? And what if Goldman had been black? Or if any one of the 6 racial permutations and combinations would have been in place of race in the participants? Add to this the question of how would it have gone if Simpson were white, and combine this again with the permutations of victim racial identities, and you have in place an extraordinarily large number of variables. And of course, if any of these conditions had prevailed, the way the case was presented in that courtroom would have changed. Look at the idea of 1 versus 2 victims. Suppose that Nicole Simpson or Goldman had been killed alone, presuming either would have been killed had they been alone. Would the jury have been more or less sympathetic to the defendant had he been presumed to have killed a man he believed, correctly or incorrectly, to be his former wife's lover? Would the jury have looked less favorably on the defendant had his former wife been the only victim? Look at the character of the victims. We have research, particularly on the offense of rape, that for juries tend to be responsive to the criminal complaints by women only if they have, or particularly if they have, morally impeccable credentials in the jury's eyes. The lead defense attorney, who spoke 2 weeks ago on a site just a little bit to the west of where we are right now, suggested that much remains to be disclosed about the 2 murder victims that could not be brought out during the trial. His implication was that that message would not be savory. That issue aside, the defense handled the character of the victims with understandable discretion and delicacy, though not altogether did they disregard it. We learned, for example, that Mrs. Simpson's 2 sisters had been financed by Mr. Simpson to go to college, and lo and behold, they dropped out. We also heard some details, for example, on one of Mrs. Simpson's allegedly numerous adulterous affairs. But these considerations lessen the jury's sympathy for the victim and subtly or otherwise add a few points to the defendant's scorecard? Suppose, and I'll keep on this litany for a brief while, suppose Johnny Cochran, as he had been for much of his life or some of his life, been the prosecutor. Christopher Dalton had been the leader of the defense team. Was it Cochran's style? Was it his forensic talent that made a difference? Or was it the evidence that he and his colleagues mustered that carried the day? Did the fact that Marcia Clark was a woman, and did the fact that she was a Jewish woman, was that known to the jury? Did it make any difference? Suppose the judge had been black or white, and suppose that he had not at one time been a subordinate to Cochran in the district attorney's office. Suppose also that he had been more relentless in cutting off rambling, repetitive questioning and argumentation and eliminating the more peripheral lines of testimony. And look again at race. There were seemingly fundamental and vital racial components in the case. The fact that Simpson was black, the fact that a large majority of the jury was white. Very early on in the case, Vincent Bugliosi, who is a superstar, had been a superstar in the Los Angeles prosecutor's office, suggested that it was probably true that the Simpson case had been lost before it was tried, because it had not been tried or not been filed in Santa Monica, the venue in which the murder took place. There are a lot of explanations for that. The most persuasive one, I suspect, is that the district attorney in Los Angeles was overconfident. Experimentally, we would like to know if a different racial makeup of the jury would have seen a different outcome. But again, I have to point out that the case would have been tried differently. Remember, for example, that in the first huge exuberant outburst of Mr. Cochran at the end of the trial, almost immediately his overwhelming thanks, went to the woman who had submitted to the jury a 264-item questionnaire and had constantly monitored its response and fed that information into the prosecuting case. Considerable uncertainty also is involved in the way the prosecutor presented its case. Again, I will truncate this. My feeling essentially is that the prosecution wildly overtried the case. They presented altogether too much evidence. I think the jury, in terms, for example, of Michael Knox's book, the one that was written before the verdict, after Mr. Knox was thrown off the case, he said that he thought Simpson was guilty at the time he was thrown off, but he would look very hard at evidence to the contrary. I think the prosecution gave the jury that kind of evidence. They gave them enough reason to find reasonable doubt, and the jury then focused on that evidence and ignored what might have been considered by some people harder evidence. That is, it gave them an explanation, a rationale. I could go on in considerable length detailing variables that might have been relevant to the outcome of the People versus Simpson case. I hope by now my point is clear enough, and I hope it's been demonstrated at least with some adequacy. We do not really know, we will not know, how the dynamics of one particular case were influenced by any of the innumerable and important variables that made up the essential ingredients of that case. We will not reach a better understanding of those ingredients until scientists dig their teeth into research agenda that is in a very sophisticated manner begins to probe questions that have been raised by the public, the legal, and the academic debate. Members of this panel, and let me conclude with that, members of this panel have been asked to address the issue of implications for the trial for the future criminal justice. I certainly second Jerry Skolnick's comments. I've got them down here. I'll go through them very quickly. I think jury selection, I think unanimous verdicts, I think comments outside the courtroom by lawyers will all come under very intense scrutiny. I think it's about 40 years ago that I wrote a considerable number of articles, one for the ABA Journal on television trials, in which I argued very strongly against it. They were just beginning at the time. I've changed my mind on that. I shan't go into the reasons why. But essentially, it's not going to change very much. When more than 90% of criminals, the overwhelmingly large number of plea bargain, jury trials are a very auxiliary, though of course obviously very significant, aspect of the administration of criminal justice, but they're really not its guts. They're really the excitement and the drama and the, in a sense, the front stage work while the rest of it goes on behind the curtain. Last remark, I can't resist a final comment on what I see to be the significance, of, if any, of the Simpson trial in regard to race relations in the United States. My view is eccentric. It's very possibly misguided, though that would be the first time. I was cheered by a number of matters that seemed to me to signify new and positive developments. Take, for instance, the reference by Maureen Dowd in her New York Times column the Sunday after the verdict, in which Miss Dowd referred to Johnny Cochran as, and I quote, odious. However insulting, and it is quite insulting, the comment represents a reaction to a human being, one who is being regarded and evaluated as such, and who is not given a stereotyped dismissal. Members of minorities will be taken seriously when, and perhaps only when, they display power and skills that cannot be derogated as readily, for example, as athletic ability. Skills such as those necessary to win an important criminal case. Dowd, in her typically acerbic and hyperbolic manner, was flattering Cochran, was regarding him as a person with her attention. Lest this view seem absurd beyond redemption, I want to back it up with a comment of another columnist that I found after I had written the preceding paragraph. Russ Reimer, the author of a book called American Beach, a saga of race, wealth, and justice, also thought that the Simpson trial did not open a wider rift between the races. Rather that, and I quote, these events have brought Americans closer together. For him, the trial narrowed a chasm in perception, allowing whites to see more clearly than they had before how blacks view the justice system, and more generally, how they feel about life in a society that is rigged against them. This time, Reimer writes, whites and blacks gathered together in a public square to point fingers at each other angrily. Others may call this evidence of a new and widening gap between the races, but I don't. Concluded Reimer, I call it progress. Hopefully both Reimer and I have hold on a bit of truth, and hopefully we are not being ensnared by Pollyanna sentiment. Thank you.
The next speaker is James Fyfe.
Thank you for coming to see me. I wanted to bring this down a notch. I know that both Jerry and Gil have approached this from a very theoretical perspective, Jerry much more than Gil. And I'd like to discuss it in terms of what it means for the police, and in terms not of the evidence in the case, but of the context in which it took place. I think certainly the case is an illustration of the racial divide that exists in the United States, the reaction to the verdict from whites and African Americans is split right down the middle. So it's certainly an illustration of that. I think it's also an illustration of the great depth of the racial divide in Los Angeles. I consider myself a police scholar, although not everyone agrees with me. Years ago, Chief Geis wrote me a letter saying that as a scholar I was woefully lacking. But one question I have for this group is this, that if you think about policing in Los Angeles County, there are 51 police departments in it. Between the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, there are about 16,000 police officers, which are 3 or 4% of all the police in the United States. And an interesting question for this group is how many police scholars have ever been permitted inside the doors of the Los Angeles Police Department, or have ever conducted any research on police practices in LA. And I suggest to you that that should tell us something as scholars, that it's a police department that has essentially closed itself off to the rest of the world. And I think the consequences of that were revealed in part in the case. As I look back, in 1980, Larry Sherman, Craig Uchida, and I did a study of the investigation of police shootings by the district attorney's office in Los Angeles. That was, research was initiated while Johnny Cochran ran that office, and it was continued after Gil Garcetti took the office over. That was research into the practices of the Los Angeles Police Department that had been mandated by the DA's office. Prior to that, Marshall Meyer had conducted studies of police shootings in Los Angeles, and that was research that was forced upon the department by the Board of Police Commissioners in response to the same controversial shooting that led to the research that Uchida and Sherman and I did. Prior to that, interestingly, the only research I know of that has been conducted of policing in Los Angeles was done by Jerry Ullman in the early 1970s, where he found that the use of force by police officers among the 51 police departments in Los Angeles County had very little to do with violence in the county, but had to do with the personal philosophies and policies of the police chiefs. And my sense is that when police chiefs in Los Angeles County read that, they closed their doors to researchers. That work was done in 1973. But I think Los Angeles is a very unique policing context. I've spent quite a bit of time out there, and I've made some observations about the manner in which policing is conducted. And I think the sense of many of the people on that jury. I've worked with both Garcetti and with Cochran, and as I watched the trial on TV, I could see Cochran making some appeals to factors that I don't think are general knowledge. We all are obviously aware of the Rodney King incident and the verdict that followed and the very negative consequences that followed that, and the illustration of the racial divide provided by that case. There are other interesting contextual factors in Los Angeles that most people are not aware of. About 5 years ago, an Asian woman was shot and killed by a young black man in Westwood who escaped. And the police department, in response to that, initiated an operation called Operation Hammer. And Operation Hammer, over the next several months, arrested what I hear is 18,000 young black men who were reasonably close to the description of the shooter. And those people were taken into custody. 18,000 young black men's Friday and Saturday nights were ruined. They were held for 6 or 7 hours, and they were released after having been demeaned with no charges in all but about 50 or 55 cases. Those 50 or 55 people were found to be in possession of something they shouldn't have been in possession after they had been arrested. So it seems to me that if you multiply that out into uncles, aunts, cousins, brothers, mothers, and fathers, there are very few African Americans in Los Angeles who don't know someone who was affected by that. Another contextual factor, I think, is an operation that's pretty well known in Los Angeles called the Dalton Avenue raid. Several years ago, the Los Angeles Police Department received information, bad it turned out, that people who lived in a 6-family apartment house were dealing cocaine. And they raided it with more than 80 police officers and trashed the house. They did $300,000 worth of property damage to the house. They tore toilets and sinks from walls, flooded the house, spray painted the interior walls with spray cans that said LAPD rules, and were not disciplined by their police department until the district attorney's office became involved in this. The immediate consequence of their raid was the seizure of a couple of small amounts of cocaine and marijuana. But there was no drug dealer there, and $300,000 of property damage to the homes of brown and black people were done. So we have those contextual variables. Another contextual variable, I think, is Chief Geis and his history of remarks. As I look back over the last 15 years, and Geis' tenure in office, it seems to me that he's insulted virtually everybody. He began his tenure in office by telling a group of Hispanic officers who had sued him for discrimination on promotional exams, in effect, that the reason that they didn't do well on promotional exams was that Mexicans were too lazy to study. Subsequently, he made his well-known comments, for which he got an Esquire magazine Dubious Achievement Award, about whether blacks and normal people had different circulatory systems. And, that was to account for the disproportionate number of African Americans after the application of the chokehold. A newspaper, a TV anchor woman made some comments about him, and he called her a loudmouth Aryan broad. He was questioned about a a shooting of a Latino, and he said he didn't understand why everybody was concerned about that, because after all, it was just a drunken Salvadoran. And prior to the Olympics, he gained some notoriety by telling the city council that he had information. Bad it turned out that the recent Soviet Jewish immigration to Los Angeles had been taken advantage of by the KGB, and that many of the people who were thought to be flights of fugitives from Soviet oppression of Jews were actually KGB agents who were planted to undermine the Olympics. And, that was in response to a request for some more funds for the Olympics. So I think you've really got to take that into consideration when you look at the verdict and what it means. It took place in a very, very unusual place. It's unusual for many reasons. One of the reasons that it's unusual is that I think it changed the view of many Americans as to the shape and face of racism by the police. I was a police officer. I've spent most of my life living right on the East Coast, or all of my life living right on the East Coast. And I think most people from the East and the Midwest have a view of what a racist police officer is. And I think the view that most people share is that he looks kind of like Frank Rizzo or Bull Connor, that you can tell because he snarls and his suits don't fit right, and he still wets his hair. But my experience in Los Angeles is very different. My experience is that guys who look like Joe Friday, guys who are brush cut and very articulate and very trim, do some of the worst things. I think most of my white friends who watched the testimony of Mark Fuhrman and then heard the tapes were very surprised by what they saw as a contrast. And I think Mark Fuhrman's testimony is interesting because I think it puts the coffin nail into a particular style of American policing that really had its epitome in Los Angeles. And that style was the style of looking good, but not caring too much about doing good because nobody ever asks. And that's not what happened in this case. Most of my experience in courtrooms in the last 15 years has been in civil rights cases and police malpractice cases. The other day I counted the cases in Los Angeles in which I have been involved, and I count about 33 cases in which I've testified. And I am convinced by objective physical evidence or by other evidence that to me is very convincing that the police lied in at least 31 of them. And that in the other two, they had no opportunity to lie because their actions were videotaped. So I think an interesting problem in LA is that the lie had, I watched the film Rob Roy with my wife a couple of weeks ago, and Jessica Lange had an interesting line in it. She said, to him, a lie is the truth is a lie undiscovered. And I think that has been the sense out there, that we can say anything, and as long as we don't give access to anyone who might be interested in finding out the veracity of it, we can get away with it. And obviously, that did not happen in this case. As Geis pointed out, most cases are plea bargain, and what the police do never comes into issue. This was a case in which the lead trial lawyer is a very active and experienced civil rights lawyer who was used to changing the focus of a case from what the defendant did to the practices of the police officer. And he did it very well. And what to me was very interesting in the trial was the very first few minutes of the testimony of Detective Van Adder under Johnny Cochran's cross-examination. Van Adder had come across as everybody's father, a very nice guy. And when Cochran asked him questions about his training and what he knew about DNA, he answered with a series of no, and answers like 20 years ago and 5 years ago. And I picked it up around the office, but I never had any formal training on that. So I think one very interesting thing that happened in Los Angeles in that case was that the accountability of the police was increased very dramatically. And in my conversations with other police officials from other parts of the country, it has caused them to do a gut check on precisely how they use their offices. Another issue, I think, that relates to the Los Angeles Police Department is the arrogance of the department. Stacy Kuhn, as you know, was videotaped doing something wrong. It's not the first time Stacy Kuhn was videotaped doing something wrong. He had been caught in prior videotapes doing wrong things. Mark Fuhrman memorialize his wrongdoing. Mark Furman tried to retire from the police department, saying that he couldn't stand to be around blacks and Hispanics anymore. And my Eastern friends all said, how could they possibly put him in one of the most sensitive and visible jobs in policing, investigating homicides on the west side of LA? It just seemed improbable that he would not be operating a tow truck or directing traffic someplace rather than being put into that kind of position. So a last point I would make, and this is an extremely procedural point. The night of the slow-speed chase was one of the most surreal nights of my experience. I was home with my family, and the Knicks started to play in the playoff game. So we sat down to watch the Knicks, and in the backyard, Meg Ryan and Tim Robbins were filming a movie scene. And then on the tube came the slow-speed chase. So my kids alternated between watching the movies in real life and watching real life on TV. But the thing that, as I was watching that, I was reading a deposition from a police sergeant in Illinois who had been involved in a shooting of an emotionally disturbed woman. And he had gone to the house of this woman, who's a poor woman who lived in a trailer. And she had been running around the neighborhood with a knife, threatening people. By the time the police got there, she had retreated to the trailer. The cops went to the scene, tried to talk to her. When they went to the door, she stood up with the knife and waved it at them. And a police officer wisely retreated. But his sergeant said, we can't back off, we've got to go in there. So they did, and what happened was predictable. If you go after a 4-foot-wide woman with a knife in an 8-foot-wide house, either she's going to stab you or you're going to kill her. And that's what they did. They shot and killed her. And as I was watching the chase, I was reading the deposition in which the sergeant was asked, would you have tried to negotiate with her? I wouldn't do that because she was crazy. There was nothing to talk to her about. Well, suppose you had been able to talk to her. Would you have done that? Well, for a while. For 15 minutes? Well, maybe for 15 minutes. What about 3 hours? Nothing is worth 3 hours, he said, which was very interesting because the great restraint of the LAPD in that chase, I think, has created an expectation among jurors that that's the way police officers should handle emotionally disturbed people. And I've been involved in 3 or 4 cases where I've been able to point to that as an example of the manner in which police officers should take great advantage of time and treat all encounters with emotionally disturbed persons as though they were on national TV. In the end, I think that, unfortunately, they're not. In the end, I think that the Simpson trial will have a good effects for both the system and the society. I think he did it. But I think also that we should keep in mind that this is not the first time that contextual factors, especially those related to race, have influenced the outcome of a trial. I thank you.
Our final speaker is Dr. Dershowitz.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I particularly want to comment on the diversity of the panel. All 4 of us, it turns out, are from Brooklyn. 3 of us are from the same neighborhood of Borough Park in Brooklyn, and I now understand the reason. It is a pure scientific experiment. The only variable is that I am a lawyer. Everything else has been held constant. Jerry, who was my teacher, talked about the search for truth and how the criminal trial as a search for truth may suffer in its reputation as the result of this case. The concept search for truth was mentioned 77 times by lawyers in the Simpson case, both sides. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth than that the trial is a search for truth. Just contrast for a moment how you do your work as scientists with the way lawyers do their work. You don't have exclusionary rules. You don't have concepts like proof beyond a reasonable doubt, under which if you come to a conclusion, you are to reject it if it's more probable than not. You don't have judgment by a heterogeneous, randomly selected group whose main qualification is that they have no opinions and little knowledge about the subject. And so the criminal trial is not a search for truth. It's an attempt to balance searching for truth with a variety of other very important values in our system. Values of privacy, values of racial equality, values of legitimacy, and therefore don't ask too much of a legal system. It is not a scientific quest. Moreover, truth in the legal system is complex. There is ultimate truth. Did he do it or didn't he do it? And prosecutors tend to focus on that for a very good reason. Mostly ultimate truth is on their side. Statistically, most criminal defendants, of course, are guilty, and thank God for that. None of us would want to live in a country where most criminal defendants were innocent. That might be Iran or China. It's not the United States of America. And so prosecutors seize the mantle of ultimate truth. On the other hand, defense attorneys focus very hard on intermediate truth. Why? Because defendants don't tend to put on cases, whereas the prosecutors put on cases largely consisting of police testimony, much of which, it turns out, is not the truth, the whole truth, or anything but the truth. Therefore, defense attorneys emphasize the intermediate truth while prosecutors emphasize the ultimate truth. Defense attorneys claim that prosecutors are evading the truth. Prosecutors claim that defense attorneys, us, are confusing the truth, and both, of course, are right. And that's the way a trial is supposed to work. I want to take that and put it in the context of this case and explain to you why the jury did the right thing and why I think Jerry is wrong about his analysis of a Brentwood jury, and why I think most of you, if you had sat on that jury, would have, albeit reluctantly, voted to acquit. The jurors all started by hearing Officer Van Adder lie directly to them. This is not a case about Furman, mostly. The jury didn't know much about Furman. They knew a lot about Van Adder. Van Adder said to them, "I no more suspected OJ Simpson of killing his wife than I did Robert Shapiro." Well, that doesn't pass the giggle test. If he didn't suspect OJ Simpson, then he's the only man on the face of the earth who didn't suspect OJ Simpson. He also was told that OJ Simpson had previously had an encounter with his wife by Furman, who had gone to that encounter. Of course he suspected OJ Simpson. Of course he was lying through his teeth. Of course the other 3 police officers who said they didn't suspect OJ Simpson were covering for him. And of course the dispatcher, the high-ranking officer, was lying when he said that they sent him to the scene of the crime only to notify. Now, they may have had 2 ideas in mind, one to notify, and the other to see if they could get him before he got lawyered up and before he took precautions. They had 2 ideas in mind, but they lied about one of them, and the jury heard them lie. Interestingly enough, so did the judge, both judges, but the judges pretended to believe that he was telling the truth. That gets to the issue of judges versus jurors as fact finders. Jurors are better fact finders than judges are when it comes to issues like police perjury, because they don't hear it as much. And for them, being lied to is shocking. For judges, being lied to is routine. And so these jurors simply didn't buy the Van Adder testimony. They said, this man is lying to us. And then they're told the following: the man who just lied to you walked around for 3.5 hours with O.J. Simpson's blood. What was he doing with that blood? And then they learned the following fact: the major evidence, the most incriminating piece of evidence, were the socks found in O.J. Simpson's room on a white carpet. They see a videotape, and there are no socks. The socks aren't there during the original search. Then they see an inventory, and the inventory says the socks had no blood on them. Then they find out the blood was discovered on the socks after Van Adder was walking around for 3.5 hours with O.J. Simpson's blood. Then they hear from the world's leading expert on blood splatter that the splatter on the socks was consistent with having been put on socks when they were lying flat, but not consistent with being put on socks when they were being worn by somebody. Then they hear the prosecutor saying, essentially, look, there's a clear test. We just do an EDTA test. If there is any EDTA, that conclusively proves that it came from the reference sample in the tube. But if there is no EDTA, that conclusively proves that it came from the human body. Defense, will you accept this test? We will accept it no matter what the results are. The results come back, EDTA. A little bit, but EDTA. When the jury hears all of that, they say to themselves, we have a cop who's lying. We have 4 other cops who are covering for him. We have suspicious circumstances. It seems to us that there is a high probability that evidence may have been tampered with. I'm not talking only about the black jurors now. I'm talking about a juror named Anise Ressenbacher, who was a white woman juror who the defense was terrified about, because we learned halfway through the trial that in a previous trial, she had been the only holdout in 11-1 for acquittal, and she turned the jury around for conviction. Not a soft woman. By the way, she came to the conclusion that she thought O.J. Simpson did it. But she decided, as the result of listening to the Van Adder testimony and hearing the evidence on the socks, that the police tampered with evidence. Then she moved to the glove, and she said the glove was very suspicious. It was damp when it was found. We did an experiment. It was my idea to do this experiment. I did it at home. The sock and the glove experiments, I have ruined more gloves and more socks, showing family members this experiment. The glove experiment is very simple. You just take two pair of identical gloves and put the same amount of liquid blood on them, and you take one of them and you leave them out all night in the conditions in which they were supposed to have been left out, and you take the other and you put it in either a pocket or a plastic bag, and you find the one that was left out all night is dry, bone dry, and the other one's damp. And when Furman allegedly found the glove, he said it was damp. It just was not consistent with the scientific evidence. Also, there was no blood around it. And also, the prosecution provided no theory about how the glove could have been dropped there. They abandoned their theory that OJ Simpson tried to climb over the fence, because you couldn't climb over the fence and the vegetation around the fence hadn't been disturbed. So these jurors, white and black, came to the conclusion they had some real doubts, real doubts. All the jurors, every one of them that have spoken, have said, A, the police lied to them, and B, the police tampered with evidence. Now, here the jury splits. Some of the jurors say, as the result of that, we can't trust any of the evidence. And as a result of not being able to trust any of the evidence, we just don't know. We think he may have done it, but we can't be sure beyond a reasonable doubt. Some jurors took a much more interesting point, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands and tell me how you would vote on this. Some of the jurors took the following point. They said, we are convinced the police framed a guilty man. That is, the police planted evidence against a man who was in fact guilty. And they said to themselves, we just can't vote to convict a guilty person who has had the evidence planted against him. That sends a terrible, terrible message. That may have been what Johnny Cochran is referring to when he said send a message. By the way, this case was not won in closing argument. This case was won in the first month of the case, before the jury trial and before the selection of where the jury was going to be held. It was won and lost as the result of how the physical evidence was handled. All the jurors have focused on the physical evidence. But I want to put it to you for a moment. How would you vote? Damn it, this is like the exclusionary rule. This is like somebody who should be punished, being punished. I want to be very clear that I'm not expressing my views here. I'm talking about those of you who would come to that conclusion. So when you think about it that way, I think it's a very understandable verdict. And it's a verdict, I think, that sends a very, very loud wake-up call to the LAPD. Scott Turow came to the conclusion, again, I'm not stating my views, I'm just expressing his, that the prosecution could have won this case if they had played it straight. If they hadn't put on Van Adder, who they knew was lying, if they hadn't put on Furman, who they knew was lying. And they would have done without the glove. But they still would have had blood evidence, they would have had some fiber evidence, they would have had spousal abuse testimony, they would have had a weaker but credible case. And the juries all came away saying, you know, we really believe the defense case. Why? We put on scientists. We didn't put on Gerchis. We didn't put on Lopez. We made the decision when we had any doubt about a witness. The only way we could win this case was being more credible than the prosecution. We knew that they were going to use perjured testimony, and we had to not use perjured testimony. And in the end, the jury trusted the defense more than it trusted the prosecution. Marcia Clark blew this case. It was her fault, primarily. This case would have, I believe, come out the same way if it had been tried elsewhere. She had the option. I wrote a memo early on to the defense team. People laughed at it. I wrote a memo in which I turned out to be wrong. Started out by saying, don't underestimate Marcia Clark. She is as smart as they come. She is not going to be foolish enough to put Furman on the witness stand. She is going to try to figure out a way of getting that glove in without Furman. She would never take a chance putting Furman on the stand. Well, I was wrong. She was not smart. She was dumb. She mishandled this case. She made a stupid decision to put on a man who she knew was good, and an unethical decision. A decision to put on a witness who she knew was lying. How did she know? One of her own assistant DAs told her that this was a man who was an evidence planter, a liar, a racist. The only thing she didn't know, and we didn't know, is that we could prove it by tapes. This is the Rodney King case, in many respects, audio version. And I had only wished that the Rodney King case had come out slightly differently. I wish that the police officers had testified first before the videotapes were made known. Wow, would that have been a show for the world to see. And that's what happened here. What happened here is she knew that she was putting on perjured testimony. She just thought she wouldn't get caught. She just thought that nobody would ever come up with proof. All she had were 3 witnesses, good Samaritan witnesses, who she was prepared to destroy and devastate. A woman like Kathleen Bell, a nice, decent woman who thought O.J. Simpson was guilty, but who felt an obligation to come forward and testify that Furman had made these horrible racist comments to her. Marcia Clark was prepared to absolutely devastate and destroy this good and decent woman. Talk about intermediate truth. Because she felt she had ultimate truth on her side. And this was one of the first cases in my 32-year experience where honesty would have been the best policy. Where the prosecution actually would have done better had they played it straight. And Scott Turow is right about that. I don't know that they would have won. I don't know that this case was winnable in light of what happened in the first several weeks in terms of evidence gathering. But I know this, that when you try to con a jury, when you try to fool a jury, in this kind of a case, it's not going to work. Now, what about race and money? Yeah, race matters. Race always matters. Race matters when a jury is all white. This case would have, in fact, come out perhaps differently if there were no African Americans on the jury, or no people who had ever experienced what we've heard about many African Americans experience, because the white jurors from middle-class neighborhoods would have been wrong. They would have said, cops don't lie. Cops don't plant evidence. Cops don't do things like that. Cops are our friends. And so, yes, race matters. Race helps. Diversity helps. Getting more people with different backgrounds on a jury helps. Money, it sure helps. Let me tell you, if O.J. Simpson had been just some poor fella who needed a legal aid lawyer and didn't have access to Barry Scheck and to Baden and to Henry Lee and to lawyers traveling all over the country to get him the tapes, he might have lost this case. Money matters, tragically. Money matters in health care. Money matters in housing care. Money matters in what kind of legal representation you get. The interesting thing is that if O.J. Simpson had been sick instead of indicted and had gone and put together a dream, I hate that term, dream team. We were the lean team. We had 13 lawyers. They had 43. But if he had put together a dream team of doctors, a group, the best anesthesiologists, the best oncologists, the best cardiologists, nobody would have complained. He earned the money. They got a lot of bumps and bruises, earned the money the hard way. He's entitled to spend it any way he wants. But when you spend your money in a legal case, people say, he got too much justice. They never say he got too much health care. He got too much justice. And what we want to do is bring everybody down to the level of the poorest, because we don't want to see defense lawyers able to challenge the prosecution's case. If we were not able to challenge the labs, the DNA, the forensics, if we had to accept everything that was provided by the LAPD, the result may very well have been different. Our challenge, I think, helped not only O.J. Simpson, but helped many other cases in the future. I know many of you think that the result ultimately was the wrong result, and I'm not going to comment on that. In America, you are entitled to hold and express those views. But I hope you will agree with me, at least, that on the subject of test the lying, which Police Commissioner Bratton, formerly of Boston and New York now, said is fairly serious problem in America and must be addressed, that this is a case about test the lying. And I hope that it will bring one message home. I have been arguing about test the lying for 25 years. I've never made a dent because I've argued primarily from the civil liberties point of view, that it hurts the rights of citizens for police to lie. Now I think maybe prosecutors are learning that it also may hurt their cases. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions from the audience, and I'm going to call on people who raise their hands, and I'm going to ask that if I call on you, you stand up, speak loudly, and direct your question to a particular member or members of the panel. Yes, right over there.
Professor Skolnick, after listening to Mr. Dershowitz speak about some of the forensic inconsistencies in the case, I'm troubled with the idea that this case can be characterized as one of jury nullification. If the law says you must acquit when there is a reason to doubt, given the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, how can this
Yeah, I can, well, I'll try to repeat it. The question is, given what Alan Dershowitz said about the evidence, how can this case be considered to be a case of jury nullification? How many people here think that OJ Simpson was guilty? How many people think he was innocent and didn't do it? It was done by some drug dealers who were garroting people. Well, okay. I could rest my case there. I just want to say that Alan is a terrific advocate for his position. And the only thing I would say is it's my belief that this was a case of jury nullification, that if the case had been held in Brentwood, the jury would have been disturbed by the fact that the accused did not take the stand, did not say, I didn't do it, did not subject himself to cross-examination. I think there was a mountain of evidence against O.J. Simpson. I also think the cops lied. Alan told a story yesterday, which I don't know if I can tell. He said, he was asked, why do cops lie?
I asked the cop.
What?
I asked the cop.
Go, you tell the story. Well, the punchline is, it's because they can. Anyway, why does a dog... Never mind. So, I'm not unfamiliar with police lying. That doesn't, the question is, what is a reasonable doubt? And given the evidence, Alan, of course, makes a terrific defense. I watched the trial, not every bit of it, but I was convinced, as most of you, that ultimately the defendant was guilty. And, it's an interesting question. Alan compared this to the exclusionary rule. The question is whether the jury is required to impose the exclusionary rule. They're not. That's exactly right. And I would distinguish then between the exclusionary rule. I mean, the way the exclusionary rule works is that a motion is made before a trial and before a judge to suppress the evidence on grounds that the police violated the law. That is, they broke the law with respect to the Fourth Amendment rights of the accused. They committed an illegal search or an illegal seizure. And if they did, then the evidence is excluded, or is supposed to be excluded. The jury is not supposed to exclude the evidence. The jury is supposed to look at all the evidence and not reach intermediate truth. The jury is supposed to reach ultimate truth. And that's why I said I thought this was a case of jury nullification.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Jerry's comments are very interesting. He asked you to raise your hand. But that's, of course, not what a jury trial is about. It's not a referendum. What a judge would tell you to do is if you believe O.J. Simpson is guilty, you're supposed to vote to acquit. Belief isn't enough. It has to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And so the question, how many of you think he did it? Many on the jury think he did it. And he said that in Brentwood, it would have been better, because in Brentwood, all the sophisticated white jurors would have said, why didn't he take the stand? Well, they would have all been wrong as a matter of constitutional law. You're not allowed to take that into account. Maybe people do. That's called jury nullification, Jerry. When jurors take into account the fact that a witness didn't take the stand in violation of the Constitution, they're acting impermissibly. Now, of course the jury is not obliged to vote for an acquittal just because they think the prosecution may have put on perjured evidence. The question, I think the hardest question intellectually, and lawyers will be debating this for years, is are jurors permitted to do that? Not required to do it. Exclusionary rules don't apply to jurors. But is it right? Is it jury nullification? And if it is jury nullification, is it a better kind of jury nullification than, for example, just pure racial jury nullification, which unthinking critics have accused this jury of applying. Is it a different kind of jury nullification? Is it more like the jury nullification that acquitted John Peter Zenger, the man who established freedom of speech in this country, when a jury of 12 colonial citizens refused to convict him of publishing a newspaper article because they felt that freedom of speech should be protected? Is it a good kind of jury nullification when the jury says, we're not even going to get to the issue of guilt or innocence because this process has been corrupted, and we do not want to be part of a corrupted process. We stop at the point where we feel there's been corruption. By the way, that is very common. Let me give you my quick fix on the William Kennedy Smith case. Why did William Kennedy Smith get acquitted? And we can have a show of hands here, and I think it would be probably fairly similar to the show of hands that you had here. Because what happened, tragically, it's a much more interesting case, women often who have really been raped, really genuinely been raped, lie about the circumstances leading up to it because they are embarrassed to say that they consented partially to romance but didn't agree to the ultimate sex. They're afraid that if they say that, for reasons that were described previously, juries will say, well, she doesn't deserve a rape conviction. And so women, too often, who have genuinely been raped, cause the acquittal of their rapists by fudging on facts leading up to the rape. And in that case, Patricia Campbell, I think her name was, when she told the jury she didn't know how her stockings got ripped off and she couldn't explain how her stockings ended up in the car, the jury stopped listening. What they said is, we have just heard a lie directly to our face. We don't believe that. And they never reached the issue of whether or not the ultimate truth was told she was raped, because juries are not supposed to only decide ultimate truth. They're supposed to decide ultimate truth by evaluating intermediate truth. And when the intermediate truth is presented them in a way that just doesn't resonate, it is completely understandable. We know that in our profession. That's why we have things like scientific fraud. If somebody intermediately uses falsehood to arrive at an ultimate truth, that person loses credibility with the scientific community. He may be right in the end, but you have to have means and ends. And the means of justice, the means we have selected for ultimate truth finding, are intermediate truth finding. So the case, I think, is more complex. And I'm delighted that we are beginning a discussion and a dialogue among professionals as to how to evaluate the complexity of the case. It's not simple. And there's no truth or right or wrong on one side, but it's more complex than the George Wills of the world have made it sound.
Okay, there's a question in the back. Yes, stand up.
I do not agree with those who say that this case is going to bode well for the criminal justice system in the future. I think the polls have demonstrated that the public is now very sour on defense attorneys as well as prosecuting attorneys. They say that both are manipulative and deceitful. I take issue with the fact that the LAPD is going to clean up the act now. The Christopher Commission reviewed it, and there's still stuff going on. And just like police corruption in New York City after the cervical scandal, 10 years later there was another case. And it seems to me that what this has done is further increase the alienation and distrust of the public from the political system in general as well as the criminal justice system in particular.
Okay.
There's a certain question that has not been asked, although it would not change the verdict, namely, how many people here are not sure that they can decide whether he was or was not guilty? You make the issue sound like you're either for or against.
No, I agree. Well, of course, if you say you can't decide whether or not he's guilty or innocent, if you're a juror, then you must vote not guilty. And in fact, some people have said we ought to have a verdict of not proven. I would be very happy with a verdict of not proven, because I think that's what an acquittal really says. Not proven. By the way, I agree with the comment. I don't think this case is going to help the criminal justice system. When I wear my hat as a criminal defense attorney, I can't think about the criminal justice system. I'm not a public relations officer of the criminal justice system. Criminal defense attorneys are never going to be popular. You know, think of all the people in government today who win elected offices. They're all former prosecutors, starting from the President of the United States. Can anybody name a former criminal defense attorney? There's an office in Florida. You know, they vote for public defenders. It must be a wonderful election. I can imagine candidate A getting up and saying, Vote for me as your public defender. I am the best lawyer in the county. If I'm elected, I will free all the criminals. The street will be full of robbers, rapists, murderers. His opponent says, no, no, no. I am the worst lawyer in town. Vote for me. Your streets will be safe. Don't ever expect criminal defense lawyers to be popular. Whether we win or lose, whether we have behaved more ethically or less ethically, they have the white hats. They generally have ultimate truth on their side. They are the people. They stand with the flag behind them. They represent the government. And we always will find criminal defense attorneys being unpopular. A woman walked over to me on the street the other day on Madison Avenue and said to me, I used to love you. I'm so disappointed. I hate you now. And I said, you were wrong. She said, no, I'm not wrong to hate you. I said, no, you're not wrong to hate me. You were wrong to love me. If you understood what I was about, you would never. And then about a block, this was a white woman, about a block later, an African-American man threw his arms around me and said, I love what you do. I said, don't love me. You're going to be disappointed. When I represent a battered woman, as I did a couple of years ago, you know, you are just on top of the world with your feminist friends. And then when you represent the batterer a month later, they won't talk to you. When I represented Natan Sharansky or Jonathan Pollard, I was loved by the Jews. Now I'm representing a Jew killer. So I get spit upon, and you should read my Jewish hate mail. It is absolutely unbelievable. People have kicked me out of the community, and that's what you expect when you're a criminal defense lawyer. When you're a prosecutor, win or lose, generally, I mean, look, Marcia Clark is more popular than ever, even though I think, A, she lost the case, B, she had a lot of responsibility for losing the case, and B, I think she behaved very questionably in terms of legal ethics, and yet she's going to be very, very popular and on the lecture circuit and get a lot of support. She also told the jury, by the way, you'd be interested in knowing this, she said to the jury 3 times, she said once when she was cross-examining one of the witnesses, an expert witness, are you thinking about writing a book about this case and getting rich? Why should we believe anything you say if you're writing a book about it? And then she said to the jury in the end, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I quit being a defense attorney where I was making a lot of money, and I took an enormous sacrifice in pay, and have decided that I would live out my life as being very poor because I wanted to be on the side of the truth. Before she said that, Sterling Lord, the literary agent, was apparently making periodic trips from the East Coast to the West Coast, graphing how much she was worth and how much of a book contract she would get, and yet she made those kinds of representations to the jury. But you don't read about that in the paper because prosecutors are heroes.
I feel obliged to comment on my views about how this will affect the criminal justice system. I think something that Professor Dershowitz just said illustrates one of the reasons for my view. He said that when he went into a courtroom to defend a client, he focused on the case and not on the criminal justice system. And I think that there are many cases where I've been disappointed by what juries have done, but I think that's what happens when jurors go into courtrooms too. They focus on the case, not on the criminal justice system. They focus on the facts that are before them, not with what they saw in the OJ Simpson case 2 years ago, or 4 years ago, or 7 years ago. So I think that will improve the quality. That's not a reason. The loss of faith in the abstract is not a reason to distrust the fact-finding process that juries go through. I think just a couple of points. One is that the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office will never put a cop like Mark Furman on the stand in a sensitive case like that again. They ain't going to do it. They embrace someone who was a perjurer, someone who has a long history. There is reason to believe that some of the other police officers in that case have long histories that put their credibility in doubt. That won't happen again in that office. I think it will also raise the consciousness of prosecutors to the wisdom of putting people on the stand whose intermediate truths might not be accurate. A third, I think, is the loss of arrogance on the part of the police. The fact is that the police are never asked to defend what they do in criminal proceedings. They're asked to do that in civil proceedings all the time. This was a case in which I think the whole question of police expertise and the value of forensic evidence and how you do things was raised to the fore. Those were questions that were never asked of those guys in the past. So I think in the sense that opening or that sunlight is a good disinfectant, that perhaps in the short term this will have some negative effects, but I think in the long term, like most traumas the police suffer, this will only have good effects.
There's a person in the back who's had her hand up.
I'm just curious, Mr. Dershowitz, do you believe Mr. Simpson is guilty? And if so, how does he supporting his defense?
I don't know, of course. I wasn't there, neither were you. None of us knows with any degree of certainty. I know really what you know about the case, except I have one advantage or disadvantage. That is, I've spoken to Mr. Simpson at great length. He's looked me straight in the eye and told me over and over and over again with tears in his eyes that he didn't do it. I've also seen his movies and know he's one of the world's worst actors. But that doesn't obviously conclude one way or another. I think about this in my private thoughts. They're not thoughts that I'm allowed to share in any way. I'm not a lawyer who comments generally on the ultimate issues. I'll put it this way though, I have clearly, in many, many occasions, represented people who I knew were guilty. I wrote a book about it just before the Simpson case, a book called The Advocate's Devil, a novel about an athlete. Before the Simpson case, I wrote this, about 6 months before it, about an athlete charged with a terrible crime who a Cambridge lawyer represents and ultimately gets to believe is guilty and how he has to continue to represent him. In that respect, I don't think of my job as very much different from that of a Catholic priest. If I were a Catholic priest and somebody came to me and confessed to me some terrible crime, I would not be free to disclose that. I would have to do what I could to change his behavior, but in the end, that confidentiality is more important. In fact, in my novel, I have a dialogue with a Catholic priest. This is an actual true story, in which I asked a priest who I know, what would you do if somebody came into you and not only confessed a murder, but told you he was going to do another one? Would you blow the whistle on him? And the priest said, no. I said, you mean you would actually let a human being die? He said, my job is not to save lives, it's to save souls. He said, your job, turning to me, is to save lives. And I said, no, my job is to defend liberty. My job is to stand up for the rights of my clients. Many people can't do that. I'm asked 365 days a year for the last 32 years, I've been asked, how can you represent people that you think might be guilty? And finally, I'm going to answer my mother's question, and the question that everybody else close to me asks. And you have to understand, A, it's your job. B, it's a very important job. This is not the Nuremberg defense. I was just following orders. I choose to be a defense lawyer. I love being a defense lawyer. I think it's a very important job. But it's a very important job that sometimes requires me to represent people I despise. I represented Leona Helmsley. People whose actions I despise. People who I may think are guilty, people I may think are innocent, people I don't know. In most cases, it's a gray area. You don't really. If he didn't go over the line, maybe he went up to the line. In the OJ Simpson case and the Jeffrey McDonald case, both of which I've been involved in, there are no grays. Either OJ Simpson did it or he didn't do it. Either Jeffrey McDonald killed his wife and 2 children, or he's the victim of a terrible miscarriage of justice. And we are not endowed with the ability to know. And I think sociologists, criminologists, lawyers operate under similar burdens. We make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And what we do is, when we have conditions of uncertainty, we have various rules for resolving uncertainty. We have type 1 errors and type 2 errors. And the legal system says you resolve uncertainty by saying, better 10 guilty go free than 1 innocent be wrongly confined. Now, I start out every case as a defense lawyer, every case, with a psychological presumption of guilt. Why? Because that's the way the jury thinks about it. Juries don't believe in presumptions of innocence in the beginning. They see a guy walking in the courtroom, he looks like a criminal, they're going to think he's like a criminal. So I start with a psychological presumption of guilt. Then I try to assess the evidence, and I think about it in terms of how to present it. But you're right to ask the question, and you're right to make the criticism, and you're right to say that if you could not tolerate the idea of representing somebody who you thought might be guilty, believed to be guilty, knew was guilty, had told you was guilty, and I'm not in any way suggesting that's this case, I'm talking about the generality of cases, then being a defense attorney is not the job for you. By the way, being a prosecutor might not be the job for you either, because If you're a prosecutor, you have to ask yourself, would you be prepared to bring a case to a jury if you had some doubts, but you thought a jury would convict? Today, the general rule is, if you think a jury will convict, that if you think you can establish legal guilt, even though you may think that the person is innocent, most prosecutors would today bring that case.
Marcia Clark indicated sometime this week that initially she thought that the trial should not have been tried, the case should not have been tried. And then she quickly corrected herself and they said, well, she was talking about another case. And she had some doubts from the very beginning. But what concerns me, and I guess this is directed to Jerry, is the opposition of white America to how black America saw the results of all of the evidence. And Jerry, how should that have been handled? I mean, I think blacks, in lieu of what Jim Fyfe said about the cops, really believe that there were lies throughout the trial. I mean, constantly, and that the evidence didn't show there was an element of guilt.
Julius, I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. I think you made a comment. If you're asking me, do I think that there was a great racial divide between white America and black America on this case, yes, there was. If you're asking me why I think there was a great racial divide, I think it was the business of the question of ultimate guilt. And I think also there was, let's put it this way, I think what a lot of people saw, maybe white and black here, but I think mostly white. OJ Simpson had gotten away with being a wife batterer, basically because he was a star athlete and he was a Brentwood resident, and because the cops didn't care much about domestic violence. And I think that most of the people in this audience raised their hands and they thought ultimate guilt was there. Alan is a marvelous advocate, and he's a marvelous student of the law. He really is. I mean, you've just heard him. He gives the best case for the defense and for being a defense attorney. And it's a wonderful case. And he's right that the society needs defense attorneys. And that it is, in a sense, a kind of lonely calling. Defense attorneys don't wear the white hats because most of the time they do represent people who are guilty. And most people care about whether or not defendants are guilty or not. What can I say? I can't speak for why people had this reaction, but the reaction was very clear. People were shocked. People are shocked and dismayed if they think that a murderer goes free, okay? And I was shocked and dismayed to think that a murderer would go free. And that's why I talk about Durkheim, because I do think that there is this notion that we have of justice. We can talk about procedural justice, which is really what Alan's talking about. And I teach the same things, and I know about the difference between legal guilt and factual guilt. But I don't think that most people care about that distinction. They care about whether somebody was guilty or not. Now, again, I say, I think that Alan has behaved with the integrity that he quite properly attributes to the role of a defense attorney, and that we have to respect that. I think that when I say that a jury nullifies, I think that a jury nullifies because they come to believe that there was a reasonable doubt. There was an article about the Rodney King case in the American Lawyer by a man named Roger Parloff, who defended the jury and said he could well understand how the jurors in Simi Valley could find that those police officers did not commit the crime of aggravated assault against Rodney King. He could well understand that. I recently reviewed the tapes, and I can understand what the defense attorneys there did. They freeze-framed everything so that the jurors could come to that belief because they wanted to come to that belief. But you can't look at those tapes and believe that this man who was hit 58 times wasn't hit by officers who intended to hurt him far more than was necessary. That's all I can say. I called that a case of jury nullification. I said Roger Parloff was wrong. In this case, I think this was a case of jury nullification. I think the jury was, as Alan and I would have a lot of agreement here, I think the jury was offended by the misconduct of the police. I think that when Mark Furman replaced Joe Friday as the poster boy for the LAPD, representing all of the fears and the anxieties and the resentment that those jurors, the majority of those jurors, had toward the LAPD, they could find a reasonable doubt, a term of art, as to what is a reasonable doubt. Whenever there's a case of jury nullification, it's going to be said that the jurors appropriately found a reasonable doubt. And I think one of the reasons it's going to be said is that jurors themselves don't want to say that they did the wrong thing. There's a cognitive dissonance operating here. If you voted this way, then you're going to point to the reasons you can give to vote the way you voted. And there it is.
Okay, we're going beyond the permitted time. I want to take one more question. We ignored this side of the room, and then we're going to conclude. Right here.
Could you make a comparison of the Mike Tyson case to the OJ Simpson case?
The Mike Tyson case doesn't deserve any intellectual discussion. It was simply fixed. What happened was this. It was in Indiana, and the prosecutor in Indiana got to pick the trial judge. That's the end of the discussion. Only in Indiana, and only before the Tyson case, and not since, has a prosecutor gotten the power to pick the judge. And he picked a former rape prosecutor who had been a full-time rape prosecutor, full-time victim assistance program on rape, who helped draft the Rape Shield law, and who went into the case with an extraordinary bias. And she excluded 3 eyewitnesses who would have testified that Mike Tyson and Desiree Washington were necking in the limousine 5 minutes before the hotel door closed behind them. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't rape her, but what it does mean is that she was lying through her teeth when she said she never touched him, she never got near him, and that she was totally surprised when he made a move on her in the hotel room. Those 3 witnesses would have made the difference. The jury was deadlocked for quite some time, and originally the vote was favorable to Tyson. 5 of the jurors afterwards said, had they known about the testimony of the 3 witnesses, and also that Desiree Washington had hired a lawyer for a book deal, and also that she had previously accused somebody, falsely a high school classmate, of raping her, they would have come to a different conclusion. So again, I don't know. I wasn't up there in the hotel room. I have no idea whether there was consent or wasn't consent. That's a case where if a videotape was shown, I suspect it would show that both of the witnesses misremembered, that the truth was probably somewhere in between. But the trial was a mockery. The trial was not a trial. It was a case presided over by somebody handpicked by the prosecution. That doesn't even happen in China. It doesn't happen in the Soviet Union, but it happens in Indiana. That issue is still pending before the United States Supreme Court as we speak, and I don't know how it's going to come out. He's already obviously served his term, but it's interesting because in that case, 2 black jurors voted to convict him, and yet it was, again, we're not sitting in judgment over what kind of a person Mike Tyson may have been. In fact, I think his trial lawyer made a terrible mistake. I was only involved in the appeals. The trial lawyer portrayed him as an animal, essentially. And the defense was, this guy is so bad, this guy is so obvious, this guy is so raunchy, that any woman who went up to a hotel room with him ought to have known what she was in for. Well, that may make some legal sense on consent, but it sure doesn't paint a picture of a defendant. And it plays into, I think, a racist stereotype. The young, black, athletic, somewhat uneducated kid from the streets of Brooklyn, that's not the kind of person that a predominantly white, although there were, as I said, I think 2 black women on the jury, will want to acquit. By the way, speaking of race, you know, the demographics are very interesting. The demographics show that black women, in general, are tougher on crime and vote more often to convict than any other demographic. And this was a jury, everybody knows that this was a jury that had 9 blacks on it. How many people know that this was a jury that had 10 women on it? And 8 of the 10 women were black women. So this was a demographic that we were quite concerned about. And some of the simple-minded analyses of the case say, well, you know, race trumps gender. Well, you know, it sometimes does for some people on some issues. It turns out that for many of the women on the jury, race was a more salient factor in this case than gender may have been, because the police testimony was much more directly relevant to whether he did it than was the evidence of spousal abuse. We could have a whole other session on the relationship between spousal abuse and murder. You can twist those statistics any which way. 1/10% of spousal abusers go on to murder. On the other hand, 50-something% of women who are murdered by men who have abused, who are murdered and have been abused, are murdered by the men who abused them in the past. But 49.8% of women who are murdered by men who have had relationships with them without regard to whether they battered them in the past. So these are very difficult criminological statistics to work with. Fortunately, the legal system doesn't allow any of them to come in. So, you know, there are comparisons, but the cases are very different. Again, OJ is a clear, either he did it or he didn't do it case. Tyson, if we saw the videotape, we might all be shocked. And so might Mike Tyson, and so might Desiree Washington. They might all say to themselves, my God, is that what really happened in that room? We each remember it very differently.
That concludes the plenary session. I'd like to thank the panelists and the audience.